Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column is written by a former Indian diplomat, Mr. T.P. Srinivasan, and he evaluates India's relations with various multilateral groupings and alliances. The author is of the opinion that India has become involved with a plethora of alliances, some of which are not truly serving their purpose, and India's continued membership in some of these groupings is even creating challenges for India without providing any concrete results which are in Indian interests. Hence, the writer is calling upon India to re-evaluate its involvement and membership of various multilateral groupings, and he calls upon India to do a reality check and to rationalize its relations with some of these multilateral organizations. This debate has come up in the context of the creation of the AUKUS initiative by the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, because it is being said that the formation of the AUKUS initiative reduces the strategic significance of the quadrilateral grouping of which India is a part of. First, the writer begins by talking about India's hesitation since the 1970s and 1980s in being part of such multilateral alliances. First, he talks about the SAARC grouping, or the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and how India was initially hesitant to support the formation of a regional grouping in South Asia. Back in 1980s, when the then president of Bangladesh, Zia-ur-Rahman, proposed the formation of a grouping for South Asia, the then Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was hesitant to join the grouping because India anticipated that such a grouping would create more challenges for India than opportunities. When Bangladesh proposed the SAARC initiative, it was supposed to focus on regional security as well, and India was clearly hesitant to give a regional grouping a security angle. Because during this period, India's relations with its neighbors had been affected, and India was worried that a platform such as the SAARC could be used by the neighboring countries to gang up against India and to target India by bringing up bilateral issues. But if India had decided not to join the SAARC, then it would have given out the wrong image that India is against such regional cooperation. So eventually, India did join the SAARC grouping, but as India had anticipated, the SAARC platform became an opportunity for Pakistan to target India by bringing up bilateral issues as well. The writer correctly points out that today, if the SAARC grouping has become a failed organization, it's mainly because of Pakistan's role at SAARC, where it has used the platform to target India and to derail Indian initiatives. India, on its part, did exercise a lot of caution while joining the SAARC. India joined the grouping only after its conditions were met. India had initially demanded that bilateral issues should be excluded from the SAARC and they should not be brought up at the platform. India wanted decision making at SAARC to be done by voting. And it also wanted to ensure that SAARC meetings are held only when all the members are present. But despite exercising this caution, and despite these conditions being met, later SAARC became a platform for Pakistan, just like India had predicted, to target India and its initiatives. So this was essentially bilateral diplomacy in the guise of multilateralism. That's the reason why many experts and former diplomats are of the opinion that the SAARC grouping has become more of a liability for India because clearly the South Asia region is still not mature enough to have such a regional platform. Now, just like SAARC, there are many other regional groupings and global organizations, including the United Nations, the Commonwealth Group. We also have the European Union, the NATO, the ASEAN, the G77, etc. While India is a member of some of these, it is not a member of few others, even though it has close interactions with them. Now, the problem with some of these multilateral organizations is that many of them do not have a set agenda. Many groupings do not even have a common cause or common objectives. Some groupings don't even have homogeneous members who share some common interests amongst themselves. So this lack of homogeneity and the lack of common cause creates a wide agenda for some of these organizations, which in many cases makes the organization ineffective, or in some cases, it ends up going against Indian interests. See, for example, the United Nations has a wide sweeping agenda. It deals from international peace and security to socio-economic issues and climate change and sustainable development. India definitely has a lot at stake at the UN, and its involvement with the UN has produced some meaningful results. But at the same time, the wide agenda of the UN and the lack of homogeneity amongst its members has made the UN ineffective as well, because some of the powerful members have used the UN platform only to further their geopolitical interests. Then we have groupings like the Commonwealth, where India's interests don't exactly align with the group. The Commonwealth group brought together the former British colonies under the British Crown, and obviously India was not eager to be a part of this grouping, considering its imperial colonial past. But later, India did join the group and continues to remain a member as the Commonwealth expanded its membership, along with expanding its agenda and objectives. But again, the diversity of the group has pushed the organization in different directions without achieving any concrete results, thereby making the Commonwealth a very ineffective grouping. Then, of course, India is not a member of the European Union or the ASEAN, but it does have close relations with them. And India has always stayed away from military alliances and military groupings, such as the NATO. But India has worked closely with the G77 as it provides a platform for South-South cooperation. In diplomacy, the term South-South cooperation refers to cooperation between developing countries and underdeveloped nations. India, being a developing nation, has always seen itself as a leader of the global South, and many a times has provided leadership to groupings such as G77 to help the smaller countries to raise their voice at the global level. Be it with regard to negotiations at the WTO or the Climate Change Convention, India has taken up such leadership role at the G77, thereby firmly establishing its credentials in the South-South domain. Then we have groupings like the BRICS, where it has been a mixed bag for India. See, the concept of BRIC was proposed by Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill, as he identified the BRIC countries to be the fastest emerging economies where the Western countries should invest. This concept later gave birth to the grouping BRIC, and the BRIC members even held their first formal summit in 2009 to challenge the global financial system. The next year in 2010, South Africa also joined the grouping, thereby turning the BRIC into the BRICS. Since then, the BRICS grouping has achieved a lot by establishing the new development bank, the contingent reserve arrangement, and these financial institutions, they challenge the Western dominated institutions such as World Bank and the IMF. Today, the BRICS grouping has diversified beyond global economic challenges, and it is looking into strategic issues as well, such as the situation in Afghanistan, counter-terrorism, etc. But however, India can't deny the fact that the BRICS grouping is largely dominated by China, and again there is a lack of homogeneity between the members. Because on several global geopolitical issues and strategic issues, and even with regard to certain financial and economic issues, China and Russia take a similar stand, whereas India is often left out, or it is often forced to side with Brazil and South Africa. So this internal divide within the BRICS grouping is quite inherent, and the growing profile of BRICS has undermined another organization known as IPSA, which was actually serving a lot of purpose for India. The IPSA grouping was another example of South-South cooperation, where three like-minded democracies came together from three different continents. Through the IPSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa came together to focus on common issues such as socio-economic development, UN reforms, and even climate change and sustainable development. But since the IPSA members were already part of the BRICS grouping, IPSA has lost its relevance today, and India has much to lose because of this, because the focus of China and Russia at the BRICS grouping is entirely different from the focus and interests of countries like India. While India was hoping for closer relations with China, especially to address the border issues, and while India felt that platforms like BRICS could be useful for this, things have actually turned out to be the opposite for India. Because even though platforms like BRICS, China cooperates with India, its aggressive behavior against India in the bilateral domain is quite unpredictable. Even though BRICS has created a platform where Indian and Chinese leaders get to interact frequently, it is no guarantee for preventing Chinese aggression against India. In fact, China's aggression against India has been so unpredictable that back in 2018 and 19, when the two countries held informal summits at Wuhan and later at Mamlapuram, no one would have predicted that in 2020, China would take the risk of going to war with India by raising the border tensions in the Ladakh sector, even while India and China were working together at the BRICS platform. Something similar could be said about the SCO as well. The SCO, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, was primarily formed as a grouping focused on Central Asia region, and it brought together China, Russia, and a few former Soviet republics in the Central Asia region. But today, its membership has expanded to include India, Pakistan, and Iran as well. And even though the SCO has great potential to deal with issues such as Afghanistan and terrorism, it has been unable to work out any common consensus amongst the members because the wide membership of the grouping and its wide agenda is pulling the grouping in different directions. And as we discussed, the interests of countries like China, Russia, or Pakistan and Iran, they don't exactly match with Indian interests. Then there are other groupings such as BIMSTEC that India has propped up. BIMSTEC stands for Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation. This grouping was formed back in the 1990s and it brought together a few South Asian countries with a few Southeast Asian countries. Today it has 7 members, which includes India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and it brings these South Asian countries together with Southeast Asian countries like Myanmar and Thailand. The BIMSTEC actually had become a dormant organization over the years as members had lost interest in the grouping. But from 2016, India started adopting the SAARC minus Pakistan strategy after the Uri attacks in an attempt to isolate Pakistan and to reduce the prominence of SAARC in the region. Parallelly, India propped up and tried reviving the BIMSTEC as an alternative to SAARC as a part of its course of diplomacy against Pakistan. So in the last 4 to 5 years, India has given a higher profile to BIMSTEC and has even revived the organization. And even though BIMSTEC today is dealing with variety of agendas such as connectivity, transportation, disaster management, and India has even pushed for holding a military exercise under BIMSTEC. But despite all these Indian efforts, the BIMSTEC grouping has not gained the momentum that India wanted. And this again shows that multilateral groupings can actually fail when they don't have a set agenda or a common cause, and when you don't have like-minded members who are pursuing common objectives. Another such grouping is the IORA, or the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which again was formed back in the 1990s. Initially, it was set up as the IORARC. This grouping is headquartered in Mauritius, and it was formed by India, South Africa, and Mauritius. It was set up as a regional organization to represent the interests of the Indian Ocean countries. And even though the grouping has expanded in its membership and in its mandate, it is yet to give India a strong foothold in the Indian Ocean, especially to counter the rising influence of China in the Indian Ocean. Then there are other high-profile groupings such as APEC and NSG, where India has always aspired for a membership. To gain an entry into these groups, India has relied upon American support, but its entry into APEC and NSG has been blocked by many other countries, including China. On the other hand, due to American support, India did manage to become a member of few other export control regimes like NSG, which includes the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Australia Group, Wassenaar Arrangement, etc. So according to the writer, this again shows that our multilateral engagements have to be carefully thought about because not all of them give benefits to India and they don't exactly fulfill Indian interests. In many cases, they have created more challenges and problems for India. So something similar is happening with the quadrilateral as well, because the US clearly saw the quadrilateral as a military alliance which was designed to counter the aggression of China. But India was always hesitant to give the Quad a military angle, and this hesitance of India has probably pushed the US to form a new parallel initiative known as the AUKUS with the United Kingdom and Australia. Under the AUKUS initiative, US is ready to share its nuclear-powered submarine technology with Australia in order to enable Australia to challenge China's dominance in the Indo-Pacific region. So once again, it has been seen that multilateral groups always function as per the wishes of the dominant powers, and in many cases, it doesn't help India fulfill its objectives. And in some cases, these groups even go against Indian interests and compromise India's objectives. So since India has become directly involved with a plethora of such alliances and groupings, the writer is calling upon India for a recalibration. He's asking India to reconsider its involvement with these multilateral alliances and carry out a rationalization of India's multilateral engagement, which will provide a much needed reality check for Indian diplomacy. Now let's take up a column from page number 6 that deals with the topic of forest restoration. See, forests cover nearly 30% of the land surface area on Earth. They provide a host of ecosystem services which are critical for ecological well-being and as well as for human well-being. Our forests, they play host to a wide set of biodiversity, including thousands of species of flora and fauna. Even the local human communities, like the tribals and the forest dwellers, they depend on forest resources for their livelihood. Forests also naturally help in storing carbon and thereby play a role in carbon sequestration in order to mitigate climate change. So this precious resource has come under enormous stress due to rapid economic development around the world. Several forested areas have been degraded as a result of deforestation and changing landscapes. So to reverse this process, forest landscape restoration is taken up. This is a scientific process through which the forest area is built back in order to enhance ecological well-being and human well-being by carrying out recovery and restoration in deforested, degraded land areas. See, recently, the State of World's Forest Reports 2020 was brought out by the United Nations Environment Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization. According to this report, massive amounts of forest area has been deforested and degraded around the world. The report has brought out that since 1990, around 420 million hectares of forest have been lost due to deforestation, land conversion, and land degradation. Just between 1990 and 2020, 178 million hectares have been decreased around the world just because of deforestation. In India, 4.69 million hectares of forest have been lost due to changing land use patterns between 1951 and 1995. Post 1995, this loss of forest land has been further accelerated due to India's rapid economic growth and development. It is in this context that the United Nations has designated this decade as the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. This UN initiative is focused on improving environmental conditions in order to enhance the life and the well-being of human communities. Apart from this UN initiative, there are various international conventions such as the UN Convention to Combat Desertification and as well as several national level policies by India to protect its forest cover and to restore the degraded land. See, India has a very diverse set of climatic and topographic conditions. In India, the vegetation is spread across 10 biogeographical regions, and India is also home to 4 biodiversity hotspots of the world. These forested areas of India are rich sources of biodiversity as they shelter around 8% of the global species of flora and fauna. But this critical ecological resource of India has come under enormous stress due to rapid growth and development, and according to several estimates, around 41% of India's forest area has become degraded. So the global community got together and launched the Bond Challenge in 2011 with the initiative of the IUCN. The Bond Challenge is a global effort to restore more than 150 million hectares of forest land which has become degraded and deforested. This target under the Bond Challenge was set for the year 2020, and now the target has been revised for 350 million hectares by 2030. India is one of the active participants under the Bond Challenge, and initially it had taken up a commitment to restore 21 million hectares of forest by the year 2020. According to latest data, India has restored around 9.8 million hectares since the Bond Challenge was launched in 2011, and recently India has enhanced its target to restore and recover 26 million hectares of forest by 2030. So to carry out such extensive forest restoration, a lot of scientific research and scientific inputs are needed because forest restoration is essentially a scientific process. Through such scientific research, the local ecology has to be studied where the forest area is being restored in order to specifically understand the local ecological conditions. Because if forest restoration is carried out in an unscientific manner, then it can result in adverse consequences which could destroy the local biodiversity and the ecosystem. For example, planting a forest in the wrong place, such as a grassland, could destroy the local biodiversity. So depending on the local biodiversity and the local climatic conditions and other biogeographical factors, scientific choices have to be made with regard to what kind of plants and trees will be promoted and what exact methods will be employed to carry out this forest restoration. It is in this context that local scientific research becomes extremely important to aid forest restoration, and the writer says that this is where the local communities play a critical role in restoring our degraded forest areas. Because the local communities, especially the tribal communities and forest dwelling communities, they possess enormous local knowledge which is extremely useful and critical in carrying out such restoration exercises. Hence, the writer is urging the government to ensure that the local communities are treated as one of the key stakeholders in such restoration projects because they can share not only their local knowledge and expertise, but they can also be positive contributors in the restoration efforts as their livelihoods are directly linked to the health and well-being of the forests and the ecosystems. Because several tribal communities and forest dwelling communities, they depend directly on forest produce and they draw and sustain their livelihoods through this. In fact, India's forest policies already provide for such a provision through which the JFMCs have been constituted around the country. JFMC stands for Joint Forest Management Committees, which provides representation not just for the government stakeholders, but also for the civil society and the local communities. India has seen remarkable success with regard to forest restoration due to the positive role played by the Joint Forest Management Committees. In India, more than 118,000 such committees have been formed, and around 20 million people at the grassroots are involved in these restoration efforts. So to further aid this movement and to help India achieve this target under the Bond Challenge, what we need is adequate financing in order to provide the right kind of incentives and rewards to the local communities so that they would be further motivated to play a proactive role and a positive role in these forest restoration efforts. Currently, government financing alone is not sufficient for these efforts, and unfortunately, corporate funding is limited to hardly around 2%. So there is an urgent need to scale up corporate funding towards forest restoration efforts, and even the concerned government departments can pool in their resources. And when these government and private entities work closely with NGOs and the civil society, along with the local community leaders and members, then we can aspire to effectively achieve our targets under the Bond Challenge. Now let's look at this column from page number 7, in which the writers evaluate the climate action efforts being taken up in Indian cities. This column has been published in the context of the decision of the Maharashtra government to join the Race to Zero campaign, which is backed by the United Nations. See, the Race to Zero campaign, supported by the UN, is a global campaign to bring together government leadership along with businesses and other stakeholders and investors in order to develop a city-specific and region-specific approach for creating jobs and for promoting economic growth while meeting climate action targets and while ensuring that this economic growth is sustainable and inclusive. This initiative is pushing cities and regions around the world towards net zero emissions, and more than 700 cities and regions have already signed up for this initiative. Recently, the Maharashtra government has announced that 43 cities from the state will be joining the Race to Zero campaign of the UN. The writers appreciate this initiative of the Maharashtra government, considering how vulnerable Maharashtra is with regard to aggravated disaster risk, which is a direct result of climate change and global warming. Maharashtra is vulnerable to multiple disaster risks, including floods, droughts, cyclones, etc. And despite suffering from multiple disasters, the state still doesn't have effective policies with regard to climate resilient and disaster resilient development. So in this context, the decision of Maharashtra to join 43 cities under the UN Race to Zero campaign is being appreciated. Based on this development, the writers evaluate the climate action efforts and the disaster resilient efforts being taken up by other Indian cities. In this study, they have considered around 53 Indian cities, and surprisingly, they find that most of the Indian cities, at least half of them, have already come out with their own climate action plans. Some of these cities have even put in place a climate and disaster resilient plan in order to gear up their respective cities for the future impact of climate change and global warming, where we are going to witness aggravated disasters and risks. Some of these cities which have been evaluated by the authors, they are not only displaying the right intention with regard to climate resilient planning, but some of them are already implementing their plans as well. But the problem is that these Indian cities which have drawn up the resilience plans and which are implementing them, they are all implementing isolated plans which are all focused on specific risks. For example, a city is focused only on heat waves. Few cities are focused only on floods or cyclones. And cities which are affected by all these disasters and risks are treating these events as isolated independent events, and they have separate plans for them, and there is no integrated approach. They are ignoring the fact that many of these risks and disasters are interlinked, and in a climate change driven world, heat waves, flooding, cyclones, water scarcity, etc., they are all linked to each other and they even drive each other. Hence, the writers are calling upon the Indian cities, especially the local administration, that is the urban local bodies, to adopt a more holistic integrated approach, which allows them to plan and prepare their cities for not just one specific disaster, but for all the interrelated disasters and risks. A few Indian cities, in fact, offer a few successful models in this regard. For example, Ahmedabad has been successfully implementing a very effective heat action plan since 2010. This plan has seen a lot of success and it has been very effective in reducing heat-related mortality or deaths. The success of the model has inspired many other cities, and around 17 cities in the country have scaled up and adopted the Ahmedabad model. Under this model, the Ahmedabad city administration roped in all the stakeholders, including government entities, private players, NGOs, civil society and local communities, to implement the heat action plan. A holistic approach was taken towards heat waves, and infrastructural intervention was carried out by pushing all the buildings to paint the roofs in white paint. Parallelly, behavioral and lifestyle changes were also promoted by enhancing the awareness of the citizens with regard to the impact of heat waves and the do's and don'ts that they should be following during the summer months. So this comprehensive approach of the Ahmedabad administration has led to success in heat wave management, and the model is being replicated by many other Indian cities. Then there are other regions and cities in India which are adopting a nature-based model to deal with some of the risk factors. For example, the state of Tamil Nadu, which is hit by tsunamis, cyclones and coastal flooding, has restored the mangrove cover, which acts as a natural barrier against these disasters. Then in the city of Bengaluru, wetland conservation has been proactively taken up and the encroached wetlands have been cleared, which in turn is helping in managing urban flooding and water scarcity in the city. So it is appreciable that Indian cities are taking some concrete action with regard to making their cities climate and disaster resilient, but much more needs to be done in order to overcome some of the pressing challenges. First and foremost, In these climate resilient plans, the city administrations need to consider multiple intersecting risks where the risk factors are interlinked and connected to each other. They have to give up their isolated plans and isolated approaches, and they have to create interlinks to develop a common integrated approach to deal with multiple disaster risk factors. Next, they need to solve the problem of inadequate financing by working out alternative financing mechanisms. Then the local leaders at the grassroots level have to display greater political will to prioritize climate resilient planning by realizing that this subject has electoral significance today. Next, the center, the states, and the local bodies need to acknowledge the inadequate institutional capacity of our local institutions, and they need to invest accordingly and come out with suitable policies to strengthen the institutional capacity of the concerned institutions. Then, as India gets more urbanized, long-term planning is essential, which places climate resilient and disaster resilient planning at the heart of such plans. Then all the concerned stakeholders, including government and private institutions and the civil society, they need to step up their communication with each other and share knowledge and share the best practices so that the city-specific and region-specific response against disasters and climate change events is more coordinated in order to mitigate their impact. Then finally, at the level of the citizens, there is a need to promote greater behavioral change and lifestyle change. And one of the best ways forward would be to make our cities more self-sufficient and self-reliant. For example, in cities, urban farming and terrace farming could be promoted to make the local communities self-sufficient in order to reduce the overall carbon footprint of the cities. This will also strengthen the local supply chains and make them disaster-proof, thereby giving them a greater ability to withstand the impact of any disasters and climate change events. Next, we have an article on page number 1, according to which the government has proposed amendments to the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. According to the amendment that has been proposed, the government is seeking to exclude national security projects and border infrastructure projects from the strict provisions of the Forest Conservation Act. We are going to discuss more about this topic in the coming days because this is just a proposal that has been placed in the public domain for receiving feedback, following which the proposal will be tabled in front of the cabinet for its approval, after which the amendment bill will be introduced in the parliament. So once we have more clarity on the provisions, we can take up a more elaborate discussion on the Forest Conservation Act and the proposed amendments. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: India needs to reconsider the plethora of regional and global alliances it is in and rationalize them after a reality check. Critically evaluate. The second question: in forest restoration, the participation of local communities and adequate financing and incentives are essential. Elucidate. Please write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.